Hey, what is up, everyone? I hope you guys are doing well. This story is narrated by my friend Frederick. I hope you guys enjoy it and watch till the end, guys.
In the grim darkness of the far future, there are places where the detritus of war collects like sediment in the bottom of an ocean. Vast stretches of twisted metal and broken machinery, piled high enough to blot out the sun, create mountains of refuse that tell the story of 10,000 years of endless conflict. These are the scrapyards of the galaxy, and nowhere are they more chaotic, more dangerous, or more alive with possibility than those claimed by the greenskins, the Orks. Picture, if you will, a world that was once something else entirely. Perhaps it was an agri-world, its fields stretching to the horizon, or a mining colony, its surface pockmarked with extraction sites. But those days are long gone, lost to memory and the inexorable march of war. Now, this world is something altogether different. The Orks who claimed it decades ago have transformed it into a monument to their unique culture, a sprawling junkyard that stretches across continents, reaching upward toward the sky in towers of rusted steel and downward into canyons filled with the broken corpses of 1,000,000 machines. The scrapyard is not merely large, it is incomprehensibly vast. To walk from one end to the other would take months if you could navigate the treacherous terrain at all. Mountains of debris rise hundreds of meters into the air, their slopes unstable and prone to avalanches of metal that can crush anything unfortunate enough to be caught beneath them. These mountains are composed of everything you can imagine: the hulls of destroyed tanks, their armor plating peeled back like the skin of overripe fruit, the twisted frames of aircraft, their wings snapped off and scattered among the refuse, the shattered remains of buildings, hab blocks, and manufactorums, reduced to their component parts and dumped without ceremony or care. Between these mountains run valleys and canyons, pathways through the chaos where Orks have established something resembling thoroughfares. I say resembling because these are not roads in any civilized sense. They are simply the spaces where the debris happens to be less densely packed, where it is possible to move without climbing over heaps of scrap. Even these paths are treacherous, filled with hazards both obvious and hidden. Unexploded ordnance lies buried beneath layers of rust, waiting for the right combination of weight and vibration to trigger detonation. Pools of toxic waste, runoff from countless chemical reactions between incompatible materials, collect in low points, their surfaces shimmering with rainbow patterns that speak of their poisonous nature. And everywhere, always, there is the risk of collapse, as the unstable piles shift and settle, seeking equilibrium that they will never truly find. The air above the scrapyard is thick with particulates. Rust flakes drift on the wind like crimson snow, coating everything in a fine layer of oxidized iron. Smoke rises from countless fires, some deliberately set by Orks working on their projects, others burning out of control, in pockets of the scrapyard where no one has bothered to extinguish them. The smoke mixes with the rust and with emissions from the various workshops and forges scattered throughout the junkyard, creating a haze that turns the sky a sickly orange-brown. On particularly still days, when the wind dies down, visibility can drop to a few dozen meters, and the scrapyard becomes a labyrinth where even the Orks themselves can become lost. But to call this place dead would be a grave mistake. The scrapyard pulses with a life all its own, a frenetic energy that comes from the thousands of Orks who make it their home. They swarm over the mountains of debris like insects on a corpse, each one intent on their own incomprehensible purpose. Some are looking for specific parts, searching through the chaos with a determination that seems at odds with their brutish appearance. Others are simply scavenging, grabbing anything that looks useful or interesting, and hauling it back to their workshops. Still others are there for the sheer joy of it, climbing to the tops of scrap mountains just to see how far they can see, or engaging in impromptu brawls with rivals over particularly choice pieces of salvage. The workshops themselves are marvels of organized chaos. Built from the same scrap that surrounds them, these structures are part fortress, part factory, and part death trap. They lean at impossible angles, held together by welds that would make an Imperial engineer weep, and by the sheer bloody-minded insistence of their Ork builders that they should stand. Inside, mech boys and their assistants work day and night, hammering, welding, and occasionally exploding as their experiments go wrong. The noise is constant and overwhelming, a cacophony of industrial sound that would drive a human mad within hours, but which the Orks find soothing, almost musical. It is in this environment, this perfect storm of chaos and creativity, that our story takes place. Somewhere deep in the scrapyard, buried beneath generations of accumulated debris, something waits. Something vast. Something that was never meant to be found by greenskin eyes. Something that, once discovered, will change the balance of power in the entire sector. But we are getting ahead of ourselves. To understand what happens when Orks find a sleeping titan, we must first understand the Orks themselves, and the strange relationship they have with technology. The Orks are not builders in the traditional sense. They do not design, do not plan, do not carefully engineer solutions to problems. And yet, they create. They create vehicles that should not function but do. They create weapons that violate every known law of physics but kill with terrifying efficiency. They create entire civilizations from the wreckage of others, transforming ruins into thriving, if chaotic, societies. How they accomplish this has been the subject of study by imperial savants for millennia, and the answer, when it is understood at all, is deeply unsettling. The key to understanding Ork technology lies in understanding the Orks themselves. They are not simply large, violent humanoids. They are a unique form of life, part fungus, part animal, entirely unlike anything else in the galaxy. They reproduce through spores, which they release constantly throughout their lives, and especially upon death. These spores can survive in almost any environment, lying dormant for years or even decades until conditions are right for germination. When they do germinate, they produce not just Orks, but an entire ecosystem of Orkoid life forms, from the tiny snotlings that serve as living tools and ammunition, to the hunched Gretchen that perform most of the menial labor in Ork society, to the Orks themselves in all their belligerent glory. But the truly remarkable thing about Orks is not their biology. Strange as it is their connection to the warp, that realm of psychic energy and daemonic horror that underlies all of reality. Every living thing has some connection to the warp, but in most species, this connection is individual and relatively weak. Orks, however, possess what is known as a gestalt psychic field. Each individual Ork contributes to this field, and the field in turn affects reality around them. The more Orks gather in one place, the stronger this field becomes, and the more profound its effects on the material universe. This is how Ork technology works. You see, when a mech boy builds a vehicle, he does so with a combination of scavenged parts, scrap metal, and sheer instinct. He does not understand, in any technical sense, how an engine works, or what makes a weapon fire. He simply knows, with the certainty that comes from genetic memory and psychic intuition, that if he puts these parts together in this particular way, it will work. And because he believes it will work, and because his belief is reinforced by the gestalt field of all the Orks around him, it does work. An Imperial tech priest examining an Ork vehicle would find it incomprehensible, a collection of parts that should not function together, connected in ways that make no engineering sense, powered by mechanisms that violate thermodynamic principles. And yet, in the hands of Orks, it functions perfectly. This is not to say that Ork technology is purely psychic. The Orks do understand, on some level, the basics of mechanics and engineering. Their vehicles have engines that produce actual mechanical power, not simply psychic energy. Their weapons fire actual projectiles, not telekinetic bolts. But the details, the precision engineering required to make all the parts work together smoothly, that is where the psychic field comes in. It fills in the gaps, compensates for the Orks' lack of technical knowledge, and turns what should be junk into functional, if unreliable, technology. The mech boys are the specialists in this strange art. They are Orks who, for reasons that are not entirely understood, have an even stronger affinity for technology than their fellows. Where a normal Ork might be able to maintain his weapon or perform basic repairs on a vehicle, a mech boy can build almost anything from scratch. They are driven by an obsessive need to create, to tinker, to experiment. A mech boy who is not working on some project is a deeply unhappy orc, likely to pick fights just to relieve his frustration. But even among mech boys, there is a hierarchy. At the bottom are the simple mechanics, orcs who can fix what is broken and perhaps make minor modifications. Above them are the true builders, capable of constructing vehicles and weapons from raw materials. And at the very top are the big mechs, legendary figures whose creations are the stuff of orcish songs and stories. These are the orcs who build the truly massive war machines, the gargants and stompers that stride across battlefields like walking fortresses, crushing everything in their path. It is important to understand that orc society operates on a principle that is very simple. Might makes right. The biggest, strongest orc is in charge, and he stays in charge as long as he can beat any challenger in a fight. This applies to every level of orcish hierarchy, from the smallest mob to the largest war host. A warboss leads because he is big enough and mean enough to make the other orcs follow him. And if another orc grows bigger and meaner, there will be a challenge, and the winner will lead. But size is not just about physical stature. It is also about possessions, about the trappings of power. An orc with a bigger gun, more impressive armor, a louder vehicle, is perceived as being more powerful. And this perception, reinforced by the Gestalt field, actually makes him more powerful. This creates a feedback loop where success breeds success. An orc who wins battles takes the best loot, which makes him more impressive, which attracts more followers, which lets him win more battles. This is how war bosses rise, and it is also how they fall when they are finally defeated by someone even more impressive. The scrapyard, then, is more than just a source of raw materials. It is the beating heart of orc technological progress. Every piece of debris is a potential component for some new creation. Every fragment of machinery, a puzzle waiting to be solved. The mech boys, who work in the scrapyard, are engaged in a constant competition to see who can build the biggest, loudest, most destructive creation. They hoard the best parts, guard their workshops jealously, and engage in endless schemes to steal components from their rivals. It is a chaotic, violent, thoroughly orcish approach to technological development, and somehow, impossibly, it works. Now, imagine what might happen if, in this chaotic environment, someone were to discover something truly extraordinary. Not just a tank or an aircraft, not even a warship, but something on an entirely different scale. Something that, even by orcish standards, would be considered impressive. Something that could elevate the finder from being just another mech boy to becoming a legend whose name would be spoken with awe by greenskins across the sector. To understand what the orcs have found, we must turn our attention to one of the Imperium of man's most powerful weapons, the god machines, known as Titans. These are not vehicles, in any conventional sense. They are walking cathedrals, mobile fortresses that combine devastating firepower with nigh impregnable defenses, all wrapped in a shell of ceramite and plasteel that towers over the battlefield like a vengeful deity made manifest. The Collegia Titanica, the organization responsible for the construction and deployment of these mighty machines, maintains several classes of Titans, each designed for a specific role in warfare. The smallest, the Warhound class Scout Titan, stands approximately 15 meters tall and is built for speed and maneuverability. Armed with weapons capable of leveling buildings and crewed by a Princeps and 2 Moderati, the Warhound is used for reconnaissance and flanking maneuvers, scouting ahead of the main Titan battle group and engaging lighter enemy forces. Above the Warhound comes the Reaver-class battle Titan, a true engine of war standing over 20 meters in height. The Reaver is the workhorse of the Titan legions, powerful enough to engage any enemy on the battlefield, while being common enough that legions can field multiple Reavers in a single engagement. It carries a devastating array of weapons, a massive Gatling blaster, capable of firing hundreds of explosive shells per minute, a laser cannon that can punch through the thickest armor, or a melter cannon that can turn enemy vehicles into molten slag. The Reaver is crewed by a Princeps and 4 Moderati, each responsible for managing different aspects of the Titan's operation. But the true kings of the battlefield are the Warlord-class battle Titans, towering machines that stand over 30 meters tall and weigh thousands of tons. A Warlord is not simply a weapon, it is a mobile fortress, a walking symbol of the Imperium's might. Its void shields can shrug off hits that would destroy lesser war machines, and its weapons are capable of laying waste to entire armies. The main armament of a warlord typically consists of a pair of massive weapons mounted on the Titan's arms, perhaps 2 volcano cannons, whose beams of superheated energy can core enemy Titans like apples, or a combination of laser weapons and missile launchers, or massive power fists that can tear through any armor. Additionally, warlords mount secondary weapons on their carapace, usually multiple turrets housing laser weapons, missile batteries, or anti-aircraft guns. Operating a Titan is unlike operating any other machine in the Imperium. The Princeps, the individual chosen to command the Titan, does not simply pilot it in the conventional sense. Instead, he connects directly to the Titan's systems through a neural interface, a process known as the manifold. Through this connection, the Princeps can feel everything the Titan feels. The impact of enemy fire registers as pain, the heat of discharged weapons as warmth, the movement of the massive limbs as his own footsteps. In a very real sense, when a Princeps connects to his Titan, he becomes the Titan. But this connection is not without danger. Every Titan possesses what the Adeptus Mechanicus calls a machine spirit, an artificial intelligence born from the Titan's sophisticated systems and the residual psychic impressions of every Princeps who has ever commanded it. These spirits are often angry, aggressive entities, the accumulated rage of centuries or millennia of warfare, given a kind of sentience. A Princeps must have an iron will to dominate the machine spirit, to bend it to his command, rather than being consumed by it. Those who lack this strength of will can be overwhelmed, their personalities subsumed by the Titan's artificial consciousness, leaving them as little more than extensions of the machine itself. The Moderati who assist the Princeps are also connected to the Titan, though not as deeply. Each one is responsible for specific systems. One might control the weapons, another the shields, a third the movement and balance. They, too, must be strong-willed, for the machine spirit tests them constantly, seeking any weakness it can exploit. The crew of a Titan becomes, in time, almost telepathically linked, their thoughts flowing through the manifold in a constant stream of shared experience and mutual understanding. Supporting the Princeps and Moderati are the tech priests of the Adeptus Mechanicus, servants of the machine god who maintain the Titan's systems and perform the sacred rituals necessary to appease its machine spirit. These priests spend their entire lives in service to their assigned Titan, learning every quirk and preference of its temperamental nature, memorizing the 1,000 prayers and rites that must be performed before each deployment. To them, the Titan is not simply a machine but a holy relic, a manifestation of the machine god's power in the material realm. When a Titan walks to war, it does so with all the majesty and terror of a god made manifest. The ground shakes beneath its footsteps. The air crackles with the energy of its void shields. Its war horns blast notes that can be heard for kilometers, announcing its presence and striking fear into the hearts of its enemies. To face a Titan in battle is to confront the full might of the Imperium, to stand before a machine that has been consecrated to one purpose, the annihilation of the Emperor's enemies. But Titans, for all their power, are not invincible. They can be damaged, disabled, even destroyed, and when they fall hard. A Titan that has sustained critical damage might attempt to withdraw from the battlefield, to retreat to a place where it can be recovered and repaired. Sometimes, this is possible. The Adeptus Mechanicus maintains extensive recovery operations, teams of tech priests and recovery vehicles, whose sole purpose is to retrieve damaged Titans from the battlefield. But sometimes, the damage is too severe, the situation too chaotic, the enemy too numerous. Sometimes, a Titan falls in a place where it cannot be recovered, and it is abandoned to its fate. This is what happened to the Titan that lies buried beneath the Scrapyard. How it came to be there, we can only speculate. Perhaps it fell during a great battle, centuries or even millennia ago, when this world was something other than an orcish junkyard. Perhaps it was damaged beyond the ability of its crew to repair, and they were forced to shut down its systems and seal themselves inside, hoping for rescue that never came. Perhaps the crew died of starvation or asphyxiation, their bodies still entombed within the sarcophagus of their god machine. Or perhaps they managed to escape, leaving the Titan behind, a monument to their failure. Whatever the reason, the Titan was left behind, and over time, the world changed around it. Debris accumulated, battles were fought and forgotten. The ruined war machines and destroyed vehicles from countless conflicts were dumped on the world, drawn by the gravity well of accumulation that makes scrapyards grow like malignant tumors. Orks arrived, claimed the world, and began building their own contributions to the mountains of refuse. Layers upon layers of wreckage buried the fallen Titan until it lay deep beneath the surface, forgotten by everyone except, perhaps, the Adeptus Mechanicus archivists who keep records of such losses in their vast data vaults. But nothing stays buried forever, especially not in an orc scrapyard. It began, as these things often do, with a relatively minor excavation. A big mech named Grocker had gotten it into his head that the best scrap was always at the bottom of the piles. This was not an unreasonable assumption. The newest debris tends to accumulate on top, while older material, potentially from more advanced or exotic sources, lies deeper. So Grocker had assembled a crew of Gretchen and smaller orcs, armed them with shovels, digging claws, and improvised excavation equipment, and set them to work digging into one of the larger scrap mountains. The work was slow and dangerous. Several Gretchen were crushed when a section of the mountain collapsed. Others fell into hidden voids within the pile and were never seen again. But orcs are nothing if not persistent, and Grocker drove his workers with curses and the occasional blow from his power claw when they slowed down. Day by day, meter by meter, they dug deeper into the pile, hauling up loads of scrap that Grocker would examine with a critical eye before either adding to his hoard or tossing back onto the pile. It was on the 17th day of digging, by Grocker's count, which may or may not have been accurate, given Orcs' casual relationship with numbers, that the crew broke through into a large cavity within the mountain. The breakthrough came suddenly and unexpectedly. One moment, the Gretchen were hauling away loads of crushed metal and broken components, their thin arms straining under weights that would have seemed impossible for creatures so small. The next moment, the wall of compacted scrap they had been working against simply gave way, collapsing inward with a rumble that sent several Gretchen tumbling into the darkness beyond. At first, Grocker assumed they had simply found an air pocket, a common occurrence in scrap piles where the debris has settled in such a way as to create hollow spaces. These voids could be dangerous, as they sometimes contained pockets of toxic gas or unstable material that might collapse further when disturbed. But they could also be useful, providing access to deeper layers of the scrap mountain without the need for extensive excavation. He was preparing to order the crew to continue digging through the cavity, perhaps using it as a shortcut to the materials he hoped lay beneath, when one of the Gretchen, braver or more curious than its fellows, ventured into the darkness. The Gretchen's name, if it had one that anyone cared to remember, was Scrib. Like most of his kind, Scrib was perpetually terrified of the larger orcs who commanded him, but he was also possessed of a curiosity that sometimes overcame his fear. Clutching a torch made from a piece of burning scrap wrapped around a metal rod, Scrib descended into the cavity, his large eyes adjusting quickly to the gloom. What he found there would change everything, though of course Scrib had no way of knowing this at the time. The cavity was larger than he had expected, a space that extended far beyond the reach of his torchlight. The walls were not the irregular jumble of scrap he was used to seeing, but something smoother, more organized. And in the center of the space, rising from the accumulated debris on the floor and disappearing into the darkness above, was something that made Scrib's primitive brain struggle to process what he was seeing. It was metal, but not like any metal Scrib had seen before, where the scrap in the mountain was universally rusted, corroded, and degraded by time and exposure, this metal was smooth. There was dust on it, certainly, and in places the paint had flaked away to reveal bare metal beneath, but it was fundamentally intact. The surface was painted in colors that Screbe could barely perceive in the dim torchlight, blues and golds that had once been vibrant, but were now muted by centuries of burial. Screbe approached cautiously, one hand reaching out to touch the surface. When his fingers made contact, he felt the coolness of metal that had not seen sunlight in living memory. He rapped on it experimentally with the wrench he carried for such purposes, and the sound that resulted was unlike anything he had heard before. It was a deep, resonant tone that seemed to vibrate through the entire cavity, suggesting that whatever this object was, it was not solid but hollow, containing vast spaces within. The Gretchen spent several more minutes exploring the edges of the object.
You know, one of the things I found absolutely fascinating about this whole scenario is what it says about the Orks as a faction. We often dismiss them as a comic relief in Warhammer, just the funny green guys who make everything loud and explodey. But stories like this reveal something deeper. The fact that a mech boy could look at a piece of technology that took the Adeptus Mechanicus centuries to perfect, something that requires armies of tech priests, and just figure it out through intuition and sheer bloody mindedness. That's genuinely terrifying when you think about it. The Imperium spends so much effort protecting their technology, keeping knowledge secret, and following rigid procedures. And then the Orks come along and prove that none of that really matters if you believe hard enough. It's that perfect mix of absurdity and horror that makes Warhammer 40k so compelling. Anyway, back to our story.
Trying to understand its shape and extent. It seemed to curve away in both directions, a smooth arc that suggested something enormous and cylindrical. At one point, his torch illuminated what might have been a symbol or marking on the surface, but Screbe could not read whatever message it was meant to convey. All he knew was that this was something different, something special, something that Grokka would want to know about. Screbe scrambled back up to the excavation site, his thin legs carrying him with a speed born of excitement and the knowledge that bearers of good news sometimes received slightly less abuse than their fellows. He found Grokka examining a piece of particularly interesting scrap, a component that might have once been part of some vehicle's engine, but was now so corroded as to be nearly unidentifiable. When Screbe delivered his report, breathlessly describing what he had found in terms that mixed actual observation with wild speculation, Grokka's reaction was immediate. He dropped the scrap he had been examining and, without even bothering to cuff Screbe for his presumption in speaking directly to him, demanded to be shown this discovery immediately. There was something in there, something big, something made of metal that was not rusted scrap but smooth, painted surface. Something that, when the Gretchen had rapped on it with a wrench, had rung with a deep, resonant tone that suggested vast internal spaces. And Grokka, with the instincts of a mech boy, honed by decades of scavenging and building, knew immediately that this was no ordinary find. Grokka, like any proper mech boy, immediately wanted to see this discovery for himself. He pushed his way through the narrow tunnel the Gretchen had used, squeezing his bulk through spaces that were barely adequate, his shoulders scraping against the sides and dislodging small avalanches of scrap. The smell of the tunnel was overwhelming even by Orc standards, a mixture of rust, oil, and the accumulated decay of centuries. But Grokka pressed on, driven by a curiosity that was almost painful in its intensity. When he finally emerged into the cavity, torch in hand, Grokka experienced something that was rare for an Orc, a moment of genuine wonder. The Gretchen had not exaggerated. If anything, his description had failed to capture the true scale of what lay before them. The object rose from the floor of the cavity like a metal cliff, its surface curving away into darkness above and to either side. The paint, where it remained, showed colors that Grokka associated with Hume military equipment. Those precise, deliberate hues that humans seemed to favor over the more exciting reds and blacks and greens that Orcs preferred. But it was not just the size or the colors that captured Grokka's attention. It was the quality of the construction. Even in the dim torchlight, even covered with decades of dust and neglect, the object radiated a sense of purpose and permanence that ordinary scrap simply lacked. Every weld was perfect, every panel precisely aligned, every surface machined to tolerances that made Grokka's own rough-and-ready constructions look crude by comparison. This was not something that had been thrown together by desperate hands in the heat of battle. This was something that had been built by craftsmen, by individuals who had taken pride in their work and who had access to resources and technology far beyond anything the Orks could normally scavenge. Grokka spent the next several hours examining what he could reach of the object, and with each discovery, his excitement grew into something approaching obsession. He ran his hands over the surface, feeling the smoothness of the paint and the occasional roughness where damage had occurred. He found seams where panels joined together, noting the precision of the fit and the sophistication of the joining mechanisms. He discovered what appeared to be access panels, though they were sealed tight by mechanisms he could not immediately understand. He found places where the paint had been scorched by energy weapons, revealing the metal beneath, and he recognized that metal as being far superior to the common steel and iron that made up most of the scrap he worked with. In one area, he found what appeared to be text, letters, and numbers stenciled onto a panel in the precise, regimented style that humans favored. Grokka could not read the words, for literacy was not a skill that most Orks possessed or valued, but he recognized them as markings of ownership or designation. This object had a name, an identity, something that had been important enough to whoever built it that they had taken the time to label it properly. As he explored further, Grokka began to form hypotheses about what this object might be. The size suggested something military, something designed for warfare on a scale beyond the normal. The quality of construction suggested Hume origin, probably Imperial given the colors and the styling. The weapons mounts he was beginning to identify, massive frameworks clearly designed to bear armaments of corresponding size, suggested something that was meant to dominate a battlefield through sheer firepower and intimidation. And then, as he was examining what he thought might be a foot, a massive structure with individually articulated toes that seemed designed to provide stability on uneven ground, Grokka had his revelation. This was not a tank. It was not a transport. It was not even a building or a fortification. This was one of the Hume's god machines, the walking fortresses that Orks across the galaxy had faced and feared and, occasionally, triumphed over. This was a Titan. Grokka was faced with a decision. He could keep this discovery to himself, try to excavate it quietly, and claim whatever it was for his own use. Or he could report it to the local war boss, gaining favor, but risking having the find claimed by someone more powerful. Being a relatively cunning Ork, Grokka chose a middle path. He would expand the excavation enough to determine exactly what this thing was, and only then would he decide whether to share the information or keep it to himself. Over the following weeks, Grokka redirected all his efforts to exposing more of the mysterious object. The excavation became his singular obsession, consuming every waking hour and filling his dreams with visions of what might be achieved if he could claim this prize as his own. He brought in more workers, dozens of Gretchen, and a handful of trusted Orks who owed him favors or feared his wrath enough to keep silent about what they were uncovering. He set up better lighting, stringing together power cables from scavenged generators to illuminate the cavity with harsh electric light that revealed details the torches had missed. And he began the laborious process of removing the scrap that had accumulated around and on top of the Titan, piece by piece, load by load. The excavation presented challenges that Grokka had not initially anticipated. The scrap was not simply piled on top of the Titan, but had, over decades or centuries, compacted and fused together through the action of rust, chemical reactions, and the sheer weight of accumulation. In some places, entire sections had to be cut apart with torches before they could be moved. In others, the removal of supporting debris caused collapses that buried the Titan again under fresh avalanches of scrap. 3 times, the cavity itself threatened to collapse entirely, forcing Grokka to divert resources to shore up the walls with salvaged beams and plates before work could continue. But slowly, inevitably, more of the Titan was revealed, and with each meter of exposure, Grokka's understanding of what he had found grew more complete. This was not just any Titan. The symbols he had dismissed as meaningless decoration began to resolve into patterns he could recognize. The double-headed eagle of the Imperium appeared in several places, cast in metal, or etched into armor plating. Here and there, he found other symbols whose meaning he did not know but whose importance he could infer from their size and placement. These were marks of allegiance, declarations of loyalty to powers and organizations that the Titan had served. The Titan's condition, as it was revealed, proved to be both better and worse than Grokka had hoped. On one hand, the basic structure was sound. The armor plating, though scarred by battle damage, had not been penetrated in most places. The skeletal framework that supported the armor was intact, showing no signs of the catastrophic structural failure that would have made restoration impossible. The major systems, while obviously non-functional after centuries of dormancy, appeared to be present and relatively complete. On the other hand, the detail work revealed problems that ranged from the merely difficult to the potentially insurmountable. Corrosion had eaten away at cables and connectors, turning sophisticated wiring harnesses into brittle fragments that would need complete replacement. Hydraulic lines had long since leaked dry, their contents evaporated or drained away, leaving only crusty residue that spoke of fluids that had once flowed with pressure enough to move tons of metal. Seals and gaskets had degraded to the point of dust, and every joint and bearing was frozen solid by rust and the accumulation of grime. Most concerning of all were the systems that Grokka simply could not understand. He found chambers filled with equipment whose purpose defied his analysis. Control panels with buttons and switches that seemed to serve no mechanical function he could discern. Cables that ran to nowhere, or at least to destinations hidden within the Titan's complex internal structure. The Humies had built their god machines with a sophistication that went beyond mere engineering into realms that Grokka suspected involved their priests and their strange machine cult. As the excavation progressed and more of the Titan was revealed, Grokka began to catalogue the damage it had sustained. The Titan was lying on its side, he discovered, apparently having fallen during whatever battle had left it here. This suggested that it had been mobile when it fell, still under power and fighting, rather than having been abandoned as a static defense. The fall had done its own damage, crushing some systems and jarring others loose from their mountings. But this damage was, in many ways, less concerning than the battle damage the Titan had accumulated before its fall. He found evidence of weapons impacts across the Titan's surface, craters where shells had detonated against the armor, scorch marks from energy weapons that had burned away paint and sometimes the metal beneath. In a few places, the armor had actually been penetrated, leaving holes that gave glimpses into the Titan's interior. Through one such hole, Grokka discovered a compartment filled with what appeared to be ammunition storage, the shells long since expended or rendered inert by time. Through another, he found what might have been crew quarters, though any evidence of the crew themselves had long since decayed to nothing. The Titan's weapons had fared poorly over the centuries of burial. Where they had once mounted, Grokka found empty hardpoints, the weapons themselves either removed before the Titan was abandoned or claimed by scavengers in the years since. In a few cases, he found fragments of what might have been weapon barrels or mounting systems, but these were too damaged to be useful except as raw material. This was both a disappointment and an opportunity. While it meant that the Titan would need entirely new armaments, it also meant that Grokka would have complete freedom in choosing what weapons to mount, unconstrained by the need to work with existing systems. The discovery of the Titan's class came when Grokka managed to access what he believed was a crew compartment high on the Titan's torso. This chamber was larger than the others he had found, with more elaborate equipment and what appeared to be command consoles. On one wall, partially obscured by corrosion, he found a data plate, a piece of metal with text embossed into its surface. The text was in the Humie language, which Grokka could not read, but he recognized the format from other salvaged Imperial equipment. This plate would have identified the Titan's designation, its Legion affiliation, and other important information. Grokka carefully removed the data plate and brought it to another Ork in Scarfang's warband, one who had spent time as a slave laborer for Humies before escaping and had picked up enough of their language to be useful in situations like this. The Ork examined the plate, sounded out the words with difficulty, and eventually delivered his translation. This was a Warlord-class Titan, one of the largest and most powerful designs in the Humie arsenal. It had belonged to a legion, whose name the Ork could not quite pronounce. Something involving fire and death, typical Hume naming conventions, and it had a personal designation. A name that its crew had given it, though the significance of that name was lost on both Orks. Armed with this information, Grokka began to understand the true scope of what he was attempting. A Warlord-class Titan was not some light scout or medium battle unit. It was a war machine designed to dominate entire battlefields, to stride through enemy fire and lay waste to anything that dared oppose it. In its prime, this Titan would have stood over 30 meters tall, towering over lesser war machines and most buildings. Its weapons would have been capable of destroying heavy vehicles with single shots and reducing fortifications to rubble. Its shields would have turned aside hits that would annihilate other targets. And its machine spirit would have been one of the most powerful and temperamental artificial intelligences in existence. Now it lay on its side, buried under mountains of scrap, its system silent and its crew long gone. But in Grokka's mind, he could see it restored, standing upright, its weapons blazing and its war horns sounding. He could see it leading Scarfang's forces into battle, crushing the war boss's enemies and establishing dominance over entire sectors. And he could see himself as the architect of this transformation, the mech boy who had accomplished what no other Ork had ever managed, the restoration of a Hume god machine to serve Orkish purposes. But first, he had to finish the excavation, and that task alone would consume weeks of intensive labor. Now, Grokka had never actually seen a Titan in person. His knowledge came from stories told by other Orks, tales of battles where the Humes had deployed their towering war machines and the carnage that had ensued. But the descriptions matched what he was uncovering. A massive bipedal structure, far larger than any tank or transport, covered in armor, plating, and mounting what appeared to be weapon systems of terrifying size. As the excavation progressed and more of the Titan was revealed, Grokka became certain of his identification. The Titan, he discovered, was lying on its side, apparently having fallen during whatever battle had left it here. This actually made the excavation easier in some ways, as it meant the Titan was more spread out rather than towering vertically. But it also made it harder to understand what he was looking at. Components that should have been vertical were horizontal. Systems that should have been upright were sideways or upside down. Grokka found himself crawling over and under armor plating, peering into spaces that were never meant to be accessed from these angles. He found the Titan's legs first, massive articulated structures that would have stood tens of meters tall when upright. The servos and pistons that powered them were corroded but still recognizable, and Grokka spent days examining them, trying to understand how they worked. He found what he was sure was the foot, a structure larger than many vehicles, designed to support the Titan's immense weight. The toes were individually articulated, complex mechanisms that would have allowed the Titan to maintain balance on uneven terrain. Moving along the Titan's body, Grokka found the torso, a massive box-like structure that was the heart of the machine. Here, the armor was thickest, great slabs of ceramite and adamantium that had turned aside whatever weapons had been fired at it during its final battle. There were scorch marks and impact craters, evidence of the violence it had endured, but the armor had held. Whatever had killed this Titan, it had not been a simple matter of punching through its defenses. It took Grokka several more weeks to locate what he believed was an access hatch. It was sealed tight, the mechanisms frozen by time and corrosion, but with the application of some brute force and a power claw, he managed to tear it open. The interior of the Titan was dark, the emergency lighting long since failed, and the air that rushed out was stale and dry, unchanged for centuries. With a torch in hand and a caution unusual for an Ork, Grokka entered the Titan. The interior was a maze of corridors and chambers, everything designed on a scale to accommodate humans, but seeming cramped and confining to an Ork. He found control stations with incomprehensible displays, all dark and dead. He found what might have been living quarters, though the evidence of habitation had long since decayed to dust. He found armories and storage chambers, most of them empty, their contents either expended during the Titan's final battle or looted by someone long ago. And finally, deep in the heart of the machine, he found the command throne where the princeps would have sat. It was a complex piece of equipment, surrounded by neural interface cables and monitoring systems. Grokka did not understand what he was looking at, but he recognized it as important, a key component of the Titan's operation. He was reaching out to touch it when something stopped him, a sensation he could not quite identify. It was not fear. Exactly. Orks do not experience fear in the way other species do, but it was caution. An instinctive understanding that touching this particular component might have consequences he was not prepared for. He withdrew from the Titan's interior and returned to the surface, his mind churning with possibilities. This Titan was beyond anything he had ever worked on, beyond perhaps anything any mech boy had ever attempted to restore. But the challenge called to him, the way all great challenges called to mech boys. If he could get this thing working, if he could make it walk and fight again, he would be the most famous mech boy in the sector. Other orcs would come from across the stars just to see his creation. His name would be spoken with reverence and envy, but he also knew that this was not a task he could accomplish alone. The Titan was simply too large, too complex. He would need help, and lots of it, which meant he would have to reveal the discovery to others, which meant he would have to share the glory and, more importantly, share control of the find. Grokka wrestled with this dilemma for several days, a period of introspection unusual for an orc. Finally, he made his decision. He would reveal the Titan, but he would do so in a way that ensured he remained in charge of the project. He would go to the local war boss, a particularly large and brutal orc named Scarfang, and make a proposal. He would offer to restore the Titan in exchange for resources and workers, with the understanding that once complete, the Titan would become part of Scarfang's warband. It was not ideal, but it was the best solution Grokka could devise. Scarfang's reaction to the news was everything Grokka had hoped for. The war boss immediately grasped the implications of having a fully functional Titan under his command. Such a weapon would make him the most powerful orc in the sector, possibly in the entire segmentum. Rival war bosses would have no choice but to acknowledge his supremacy or be crushed beneath the Titan's feet. Scarfang gave Grokka everything he asked for: workers, materials, and most importantly, protection from other mech boys who might try to claim the project for themselves. Within days, the excavation site had been transformed into a hive of activity. Hundreds of orcs and thousands of Gretchens swarmed over the scrap mountain, working to expose the entire Titan. Grokka brought in other mech boys, carefully selected for their skills and their willingness to work under his direction. He established a hierarchy, assigning different teams to different parts of the Titan, each responsible for assessing damage and determining what repairs would be needed. As more of the Titan was revealed, the scale of the task became apparent. This was a Warlord-class Titan, one of the largest and most powerful designs in the Imperial arsenal. It stood, or would stand when upright, over 30 meters tall. Its weapons systems alone were larger than many vehicles. The complexity of its systems was staggering, even by the standards of Imperial technology, and it had been lying dormant for what must have been centuries. Its systems corroded, its power cells dead, its machine spirit, if it still existed, sleeping a sleep that might be permanent. The mech boys began their examination with a systematic survey of the Titan's exterior. They catalogued every panel of armor plating, noting which ones were damaged and would need replacement. They examined the Titan's legs, testing the servos and hydraulics, finding most of them seized by corrosion, but potentially salvageable. They climbed over the torso, mapping out the locations of weapon systems, power conduits, and structural supports. One team was assigned to examine the Titan's head, the armored compartment where the crew had once sat. This was perhaps the most complex part of the entire machine, housing not just the command throne, but also the sophisticated sensors and targeting systems that had allowed the Titan to perceive and engage enemies at extreme range. The mech boys who entered the head reported finding it in better condition than expected. The crew, it seemed, had shut down the Titan in an orderly fashion before abandoning it, properly securing systems, and running through shutdown procedures. There were no bodies, which suggested the crew had escaped, though what fate had befallen them afterward was unknown. Another team focused on the Titan's power systems. A Warlord-class Titan was powered by a plasma reactor, a sophisticated piece of technology that could generate enough energy to run the Titan's weapons, shields, and movement systems simultaneously. The reactor in this Titan was, predictably, inactive. The fuel had long since been expended or decayed, and the reactor chamber itself showed signs of partial meltdown, suggesting the Titan had suffered critical damage that had compromised its power generation. But the reactor was not the only potential source of power. The mech boys discovered that the Titan also had backup power cells, massive batteries designed to provide emergency power if the main reactor failed. These cells were drained but not destroyed. In theory, they could be recharged, though the amount of power required would be substantial. As the assessment continued, Grocker began to formulate a plan. The Titan could not be restored to its original condition. That would require resources and expertise far beyond what even the largest Ork warband could muster. The Humies who built these machines did so in great factory cathedrals, with armies of specialized technicians and access to materials that the Orks could only obtain through conquest or scavenging. Grocker had neither the time, the resources, nor frankly the patience to attempt a faithful restoration. But the Titan did not need to be restored to its original condition. It just needed to work, and work in a way that was comprehensible and controllable by Orks. This meant stripping out many of the Titan's sophisticated systems and replacing them with cruder but more reliable Ork technology. The decision about what to keep and what to replace became a source of constant debate among the mech boys who had gathered to work on the project. Some argued for preserving as much of the original technology as possible, believing that Humie engineering, for all its complexity, was fundamentally superior to Ork construction. Others insisted that anything they could not fully understand should be torn out and replaced with systems they could build and repair themselves. These debates sometimes escalated into physical confrontations, with mech boys trading blows over the fate of particular systems or components. Grocker, as the lead mech boy, had to navigate these conflicts while maintaining progress on the restoration. He established a simple rule: if a system could be understood well enough to maintain and repair using Ork methods, it could stay. If it required specialized knowledge or rare materials, it had to go. This rule was not always easy to apply, and there were cases where Grocker had to make judgment calls that not all the other mech boys agreed with. But it provided a framework for decision-making, and gradually, the team began to develop a shared understanding of what the final product would look like. One of the first major systems they tackled was the Titan's locomotion. The original design used a complex network of servos, pistons, and gyroscopic stabilizers to keep the massive machine upright and mobile. These systems were controlled through sophisticated computer systems that monitored the Titan's balance and adjusted the leg movements hundreds of times per second to maintain stability. It was an elegant solution to a complex problem, but it was also completely incomprehensible to the Orks. The mech boys examined the leg systems in exhaustive detail, tracing every cable and testing every hydraulic line. They discovered that while the basic mechanical components, the massive pistons, and load-bearing structures were relatively straightforward, the control systems were anything but. The servos that provided fine control over leg movement were controlled by circuits that the mech boys could not decipher. The gyroscopes that provided balance information fed into computers that no Ork could program or understand. And the whole system was integrated in ways that made it impossible to replace one component without affecting dozens of others. After weeks of study and debate, the mech boys reached a consensus. The basic mechanical structure of the legs could be preserved. The massive hip joints, the knee assemblies, the ankle articulation, all of these were sound engineering that would serve just as well under Ork control as they had under Humie direction. But the sophisticated control systems would have to go, replaced with something simpler and more robust. The solution they devised was, like most Ork engineering, crude but effective. They ripped out the computer-controlled servos and replaced them with massive manual controls, essentially giant levers and wheels that could be operated by Orks using brute strength. The gyroscopes were removed and replaced with simple bubble levels, visual indicators that would tell the operators which way the Titan was leaning. The complex balance algorithms were replaced with Ork intuition and constant manual adjustment. It would not be as smooth or as responsive as the original design, but it would work, and more importantly, any mech boy would be able to understand and repair it. The power system presented an even greater challenge. A Warlord-class Titan was powered by a plasma reactor, a sophisticated piece of technology that could generate enough energy to run the Titan's weapons, shields, and movement systems simultaneously for extended periods. The reactor worked by containing superheated plasma in magnetic fields, extracting energy from the resulting reactions. It was dangerous, temperamental, and required constant monitoring and adjustment to prevent catastrophic failure. It was also, in its current state, completely dead and showing signs of partial meltdown. The mech boys, who examined the reactor chamber, reported finding damage consistent with a scram event, an emergency shutdown triggered by damage or malfunction. The containment vessel showed cracks and warping, suggesting it had been subjected to stresses beyond its design limits. The magnetic field generators were offline and showed signs of having been damaged by electrical surges. The fuel injection systems were corroded to the point of uselessness. In short, while the reactor was theoretically repairable, doing so would require resources and expertise that the Orks simply did not have. Grokka made the decision to abandon the plasma reactor entirely. In its place, he proposed installing a bank of Ork-built generators, smaller units that would work in parallel to provide the necessary power output. These generators would be simpler. Based on technology, the Orks understood well. They would burn whatever fuel was available, from refined promethium to crude petrochemicals to literally anything flammable, and use that combustion to drive turbines that would generate electricity. It would be loud, inefficient, and would produce tremendous amounts of waste, heat, and exhaust, but it would be reliable and, crucially, repairable by any mech boy with basic skills. The installation of these generators required substantial modification to the Titan's interior. The reactor chamber, once cleared of its ruined equipment, was large enough to house several generators, but getting them into position required cutting new access ports through the Titan's armor. This was not done lightly. Each cut weakened the overall structural integrity and created potential vulnerabilities that enemies might exploit. But Grokka reasoned that the benefits of having accessible, maintainable power systems outweighed the risks of a few additional access points. The fuel system for the generators presented its own challenges. The Orks needed to install tanks large enough to provide hours of operating time, but doing so meant sacrificing other internal space. After considerable debate, it was decided to mount external fuel tanks on the Titan's back, massive containers that would be visible to enemies but easily accessible for refueling. This decision also had the advantage of providing additional explosive mass that could, if properly rigged, be used as an improvised weapon in desperate circumstances. The weapons would be the next major focus of the restoration. The Titan's original armament, whatever it had been, was either missing or too damaged to salvage. The mech boys found evidence of weapon mounts on the Titan's arms and shoulders, massive hardpoints designed to bear the weight of weapons measured in tons. But the weapons themselves were gone, removed either by the original crew before abandonment or by scavengers in the centuries since. In their place, Grokka planned to mount Ork weapons, salvaged from destroyed vehicles or purpose-built for this application. The right arm would carry what the Orks called a mega cannon, a weapon so large it had originally been part of a starship's secondary battery. The cannon fired shells the size of oil drums, each one packed with enough explosive to level a building. The weapon had been salvaged from a crashed Imperial cruiser that had come down in the scrapyard decades earlier, and it had been sitting in Grokka's personal hoard ever since, waiting for a project worthy of its size. The Stomper Titan would be that project. Mounting the mega cannon required substantial engineering. The weapon weighed dozens of tons, far more than the Titan's arm had been designed to support in its original configuration. The mech boys had to reinforce the arm's internal structure, adding additional bracing and strengthening joints that had been designed for lighter weapons. They also had to solve the problem of recoil. When fired, the mega cannon would generate enough backward force to potentially knock the entire Titan off balance. The solution involved installing massive shock absorbers and recoil compensators, scavenged from destroyed tanks and mining equipment, that would absorb and dissipate the energy over a longer period. The left arm would carry a close combat weapon, because no proper Ork war machine was complete without the ability to engage enemies in melee. Grocker designed a massive power claw, a crushing weapon that would be operated by hydraulic rams, powerful enough to tear through any armor. The claw was built from reinforced steel plating and equipped with power fields generated by capacitors the size of HAB units. When activated, the power fields would crackle with barely contained energy, adding to the destructive capability of the claw's physical force. The Titan's back and shoulders would mount a variety of secondary weapons. Rocket pods salvaged from destroyed aircraft would provide saturation fire capability, capable of blanketing an area with explosive warheads. Multiple autocannons, each one a formidable weapon in its own right, would handle anti-infantry and light vehicle duties. And a massive flamer, its fuel tank, literally a converted tanker truck welded onto the Titan's spine, would provide area denial and terror capability. The combined firepower would make the Stomper Titan a threat to anything on the battlefield, from individual soldiers to heavy armor. Wiring and plumbing all these weapons together into a coherent system was a nightmare of Orkish engineering. Each weapon needed power feeds, control lines, and ammunition supplies. The mega cannon required a sophisticated loading mechanism to handle its massive shells. The power claw needed hydraulic lines that could withstand tremendous pressures without bursting. The rocket pods needed targeting systems that could at least roughly calculate trajectories. And everything needed to be controlled from a central location, or at least from locations that the Ork operators could reach without having to climb through the entire Titan every time they wanted to switch weapons. The solution that emerged was typically Orkish, a collection of control stations scattered throughout the Titan, each one responsible for specific weapons or systems. The mega cannon was controlled from a station in the head, where the operator could see what he was shooting at. The power claw was operated from a position in the left shoulder, where the Ork could judge distances and time his strikes. The secondary weapons were controlled from various positions in the torso, each operator responsible for his particular armament and coordinating with the others through shouting and the occasional use of a crude intercom system that the mech boys had cobbled together from salvaged voxcasters. This decentralized control system had advantages and disadvantages. On the positive side, it meant that damage to one control station would not disable all the weapons. If the head was destroyed, taking the mega cannon operator with it, the other weapons would still be operational. On the negative side, it required extensive coordination and communication between operators, and there was always the risk that conflicting orders or simple confusion would result in weapons firing at the wrong targets or not firing at all. As the restoration progressed, the character of the Titan began to change in ways that went beyond mere mechanical modifications. The Orks working on the project began to see it not as a Hume war machine they were repairing, but as an Ork creation they were building. They started to personalize it, adding their own touches and modifications that had nothing to do with functionality and everything to do with Orkish aesthetics and culture. The armor plating, once painted in the precise blues and golds of the original Titan Legion, was being covered with new paint in Orkish colors. Reds and blacks predominated, applied in rough, energetic strokes that bore no resemblance to the careful work of Imperial painters. Flames were painted on the legs, not precise representations but wild, chaotic patterns that suggested uncontrolled conflagration. Skulls appeared everywhere, some painted, others welded on as three-dimensional decorations, their empty eyes staring out at anyone who approached the Titan. The most dramatic aesthetic modification was to the Titan's head. The original design had been functional but relatively plain, a simple armored box that contained the crew compartment and sensor arrays. The Orks, feeling this lacked proper character, set about transforming it into something that would strike fear into any enemy who saw it. They added a massive jaw made from scrap metal, each tooth cut from steel plating and sharpened to a point. They installed huge optical sensors taken from destroyed vehicles, giving the Titan a pair of glaring red eyes that would be visible for kilometers. They mounted horns on top, great curving spikes that added several meters to the Titan's already impressive height. The result looked less like a precision war machine and more like a mechanical demon, which was exactly what the Orks wanted. As the restoration progressed, other Orks began to take notice. Word of the project spread throughout the Scrapyard and beyond, carried by Gretchen messengers and boastful Orks who had seen the Titan with their own eyes. Soon, mech boys from across the region were arriving, drawn by the challenge and the opportunity to work on something truly legendary. Scarfang, seeing the potential for trouble as too many mech boys tried to claim authority over the project, established a clear hierarchy with Grokka at the top and severe penalties for anyone who challenged that authority. The work took on a rhythm. Each day, hundreds of Orks and thousands of Gretchen would swarm over the Titan, each focused on their assigned task. Teams would strip components from the Titan, haul them to workshops for repair or replacement, and then reinstall them. Other teams scoured the scrapyard for parts that could be adapted to the Titan's needs. Still others worked on fabricating entirely new components, using forges and metalworking tools to create parts that had never existed before. The noise was constant and overwhelming. Hammers rang against metal, welders hissed and sparked, grinders shrieked as they cut through armor plating. Orks shouted orders and curses. Gretchen squealed when they were stepped on or when heavy objects fell near them, and the entire site vibrated with the energy of focused industry. It was chaos, but it was productive chaos, the kind of organized disorder that Orks excelled at creating. Not everything went smoothly, of course. There were accidents, some fatal. An Ork might fall from a height while working on the Titan's upper sections, plummeting to his death on the scrap below. A welding torch might ignite something flammable, leading to an explosion that killed or injured several workers. Equipment might fail catastrophically, sending shrapnel flying through work areas. But these incidents were accepted as part of the process. Orks, who died in the service of the project, were buried in the scrap, their bodies adding to the very mountain they had been excavating. Others stepped forward to take their places, and the work continued. As the months passed, the Titan began to change. Where once it had been painted in the blue and gold of its original Titan Legion, now it was being covered in Orkish symbols and crude paintings. Flames, skulls, and jagged lightning bolts appeared on the armor plating, rendered in reds and blacks and acid greens. The smooth lines of Imperial design were interrupted by welded-on plates of scrap metal, additional armor added wherever Grokka thought it might be needed. Gun mounts sprouted from the torso and shoulders, crude frameworks designed to hold the massive weapons that would soon be installed. The most dramatic change was to the Titan's head. The original design had been functional, but relatively plain. A simple armored box containing the crew compartment. The Orks, feeling this lacked proper character, modified it extensively. They added a massive jaw made from scrap metal, filled with jagged teeth cut from steel plating. They installed huge optical sensors taken from destroyed vehicles, giving the Titan a pair of glaring red eyes. They mounted horns on top, great curving spikes that would tower over the battlefield. The result was something that looked less like an Imperial Titan and more like a monstrous metal beast, which was exactly what the Orks wanted. As the restoration neared completion, Grokka faced his greatest challenge, bringing the machine spirit back to life. He knew, from the stories he had heard, that the Humies believed their Titans had spirits, intelligent entities that lived within the machines. Whether this was true or simply Humie superstition, Grokka could not say, but he did know that simply powering up the Titan's systems might not be enough. The machine, if it was to truly live again, would need to be awakened. The Orks had their own version of machine spirits. They believed that any sufficiently large and impressive machine developed a kind of intelligence, a personality that reflected the intentions of its builders and the experiences it had undergone. An Ork vehicle that had been in many battles and won many victories would be stronger, faster, and more reliable than an identical vehicle fresh from the workshop. This was not, strictly speaking, rational. But then again, very little about Ork technology was rational. It worked because the Orks believed it worked, and their belief, channeled through their Gestalt psychic field, made it real. Grokka reasoned that the same principle could be applied to the Titan. If the Orks working on it believed that the Titan had a spirit, and if that spirit could be awakened and brought under Ork control, then the Titan would be truly theirs. But he also understood that there was risk involved. The Titan's original machine spirit, if it still existed, had been created by and for humans. It might not respond well to being controlled by Orks. It might resist, might try to assert control, might even attempt to destroy itself rather than serve the greenskins. To address this concern, Grokka consulted with the closest thing Orks had to spiritual advisors, the Weird Boys. These were Orks with psychic powers, individuals who could tap into the Gestalt field, not just passively, but actively, channeling its energy to produce effects ranging from the merely impressive to the catastrophically explosive. Weird Boys were both valued and feared in Orc society, valued for the power they could unleash in battle, feared because that power could turn on nearby Orcs if not properly controlled. The Weird Boy who Grokka consulted was named Zargob, a particularly unstable individual even by Weird Boy standards. Zargob listened to Grokka's description of the problem, his eyes occasionally unfocusing as psychic energies crackled around him. When Grokka finished, Zargob was silent for a long moment before speaking. "The spirit is sleeping," he said. "Deep, deep sleeping. But not dead. Never dead. Spirits do not die when machines break. They sleep and dream of war. We must wake it, but gently. Too much power, too fast, and it might break free, might lash out. We need to coax it, to show it that we are strong, that it should serve us." Grokka absorbed this information and incorporated it into his plans. The initial power-up of the Titan would be done gradually, system by system, giving the machine spirit time to adjust. And throughout the process, Weird Boys would be present, channeling psychic energy into the Titan, essentially trying to reprogram its artificial intelligence through sheer force of Orcish will. The day of the first power-up was declared a momentous occasion. Word had spread throughout Scarfang's territory and beyond, carried by Gretchen runners and boastful Orcs who had been involved in the project. Hundreds of Orcs gathered around the excavation site, filling every available space and clambering onto surrounding scrap mountains to get a better view. The air was thick with anticipation and the smell of unwashed bodies, a combination that would have been overwhelming to anyone with a more refined sense of smell, but which the Orcs barely noticed. Scarfang himself attended, seated on a throne that had been hastily constructed from scrap metal and positioned on a platform that gave him a clear view of the Titan. Around him stood his most trusted lieutenants, each one eager to see whether Grokka's mad project would succeed or fail in spectacular fashion. There was money changing hands among the spectators, Orcs betting on various outcomes, ranging from "it will walk" to "it will explode and kill everyone" to "nothing will happen and we'll all look like gits for watching." Below, in the excavation site, final preparations were underway. Gretchen scurried back and forth, performing last-minute checks of connections and making sure that fuel tanks were filled and ammunition was loaded. Mech boys conferred in small groups, arguing about startup sequences and double-checking their calculations. Weird Boys, looking distinctly uncomfortable with the pressure of so many Orc eyes upon them, huddled together and muttered about the psychic currents they could feel swirling around the dormant Titan. The generators that would provide initial power to the Titan sat in a row nearby, massive machines that had been cobbled together from a dozen different sources. Each one was tended by a crew of Gretchen, whose sole job was to keep the engines running no matter what. These generators represented months of work, scavenging parts from across the scrapyard and assembling them into units capable of producing the enormous amounts of electricity needed to wake a sleeping god machine. Grokka himself was inside the Titan, standing in what had once been the Princeps's command throne, but was now an Orcish approximation of a control center. The space had been gutted and rebuilt according to Orc specifications, with control panels that featured large, obvious switches and levers, rather than the subtle touch-sensitive controls the Humies had favored. Cables ran everywhere, some neatly bundled, but most simply stapled or tied to whatever surface was convenient. The smell of fresh welding and the distinctive ozone scent of electrical equipment filled the air. Around Grokka stood the other orcs who would form the initial operating crew. There was Rotgut, a smaller but cunning orc who had been assigned to manage the power distribution systems. Beside him stood Grimsnick, a particularly large orc who had been chosen to operate the leg controls, a job that required both strength and a degree of coordination. In the head compartment, accessible by a ladder that had been welded to the interior wall, Snickgob waited at the mega cannon controls, peering through the optical sensors and occasionally commenting on what he could see outside. The moment of truth approached. Grokka raised his hand, a signal that had been agreed upon beforehand, and one of the Gretchen outside saw it and frantically waved a flag to communicate the message to the generator crews. The first generator roared to life, its engine catching with a cough of black smoke that quickly became a steady rumble. Then the second, and the third, and soon all of them were running, their combined output being fed through hastily insulated cables toward the Titan. For the first few seconds, nothing happened. The power flowed in, traveling along cables that had been spliced into the Titan's ancient electrical grid, but the machine itself remained silent and still. Grokka checked his instruments, crude meters that the mech boys had installed to monitor voltage and current. The readings were climbing, showing that power was flowing into the Titan's systems. But where was it going? What was happening inside those centuries-dormant circuits? Then, deep within the Titan, something responded. It started as a sound, barely audible at first, over the roar of the generators and the excited murmuring of the crowd. A low hum, a vibration that could be felt more than heard, resonating through the metal structure of the Titan and into the ground itself. The orcs nearest the Titan took a step back, their excitement mixing with a healthy dose of caution. Even orcs, fearless as they generally were, could recognize when something potentially dangerous was about to happen. The hum grew louder, rising in pitch from a subsonic rumble to a deep bass tone that made teeth rattle and internal organs vibrate in sympathy. Lights began to appear on control panels inside the Titan. First, just a few scattered indicators, then more and more until entire sections of previously dark displays were illuminated. Grokka watched in fascination as system after system came online, each one announcing its activation with clicks, beeps, and whirs that combined into a symphony of mechanical awakening. Outside, the watching orcs saw the Titan's transformation in more dramatic terms. The eyes, those huge red optical sensors that the mech boys had installed, began to glow. Faint at first, just a hint of red light in the depths of the sockets, but growing brighter with each passing second. The glow intensified until it was painful to look directly at them, twin points of malevolent red light that seemed to bore into anyone who met their gaze. Then the head moved, just slightly, a tiny rotation that nonetheless caused the entire crowd to erupt in roars of approval. The Titan was waking. But with awakening came problems. Warning indicators began to flash across Grokka's control panels, ancient systems registering faults and errors as they tried to restart after centuries of dormancy. Alarms sounded, their wails speaking of overheating components and electrical shorts and pressure buildups that should not be occurring. The temperature inside the Titan began to rise as power conduits that had not been properly insulated began to overheat, the metal growing hot enough to burn any skin that touched it. Smoke started to pour from access panels, thick black clouds that spoke of burning insulation and overloaded circuits. Somewhere deep in the machine, something exploded with a bang that made the entire structure shudder and sent a shockwave through the ground that knocked several watching orcs off their feet. Gretchen near the Titan panicked and fled, their survival instincts overriding whatever loyalty or fear had kept them at their posts. Grokka, faced with the very real possibility that the Titan might tear itself apart before it could even stand, had to make a quick decision. He could order the generators shut down, cutting power and preventing further damage, but also abandoning the awakening attempt. Or he could push forward, gambling that the Titan could withstand the stress of startup, and that the problems they were seeing were temporary rather than catastrophic. Being an orc, and being Grokka in particular, there was really only one choice he could make. He bellowed at Zargob and the other weird boys, ordering them to do whatever it was they did to help machines work better. The weird boys, who had been standing in a circle around the Titan and chanting in a language that might have been Orcish or might have been something far older and stranger, intensified their efforts. Psychic energy began to flow from them, visible to those with the sight to perceive it, as streams of green light that poured into the Titan's structure. The effect was immediate and dramatic, though not necessarily in ways that could be easily explained by physics or engineering. The psychic energy flooding into the Titan interacted with its machine spirit, that artificial intelligence born from sophisticated systems and the residual impressions of every princeps who had ever commanded it. For a moment, the two forces clashed. The machine spirit, awakening after centuries of dormancy, found itself in a situation it had never been designed to handle. It was no longer in the clean, orderly environment of an Imperial starship or Titan facility. It was surrounded by Orks, Xenos whose very existence was an affront to the Imperium it had been created to serve. And those Orks were trying to impose their will upon it, trying to force it to accept their commands and serve their purposes. The Titan shuddered, its limbs twitching as servos activated randomly and without direction. The mega cannon on its arm swung back and forth, its barrel tracking across the crowd of watching Orcs who wisely ducked or dove for cover. The power claw opened and closed, its massive fingers flexing with enough force to crush anything they might grasp. The eyes flared even brighter, and the war horns that the Orcs had installed, without really understanding their significance, began to sound, a deep basso tone that resonated across the entire scrapyard and could be heard for dozens of kilometers in every direction. Inside the Titan, Grokka held onto his controls as the entire structure bucked and twisted beneath him. He could feel the conflict playing out, could sense through the crude instrumentation he had installed that two incompatible forces were fighting for dominance. The machine spirit, weakened by centuries of dormancy, but still fundamentally imperial in its nature, was resisting the Orc influence. The psychic energy being poured into it by the weird boys was trying to overcome that resistance, to impose a new reality on the ancient artificial intelligence. For a long moment, the outcome hung in balance. The Titan could have rejected the Orc influence entirely, could have triggered some kind of self-destruct protocol rather than serve Xenos masters. Or it could have been completely overwritten, its original identity erased and replaced with something purely Orcish. Either outcome would have been dramatic, but neither was what actually occurred. Instead, something unexpected happened. The machine spirit, perhaps recognizing that resistance was futile, or perhaps simply adapting to new circumstances, as sophisticated AI systems are sometimes capable of doing, found a middle path. It accepted the Orc influence, allowed itself to be reshaped by the psychic energy flooding through its circuits, but it did not surrender completely. Elements of its original programming remained, creating a hybrid consciousness that was neither fully Imperial nor fully Orcish, but something in between. The visible effects of this resolution were striking. The random twitching stopped as the Titan's movements became more controlled and purposeful. The alarms that had been wailing gradually fell silent as systems stabilized and found new operating parameters. The power flow normalized as circuits that had been overloading adapted to the influx of energy. And most tellingly, the Titan's eyes, which had been glaring a harsh, mechanical red, shifted to a color that was subtly different, tinged with green, in a way that should not have been possible for purely mechanical optical systems. Grokka, feeling through the crude control mechanisms he had installed, sensed the change immediately. The Titan was no longer fighting him. It was responding to his commands, sluggishly, and with evident reluctance in some cases, but it was responding. He tested the leg controls, ordering Grimsnik to attempt a simple movement. The Orc pulled on the massive levers, and after a moment's hesitation, the Titan's right leg moved, rising slightly before settling back into its resting position. The movement was jerky and accompanied by grinding noises that suggested bearings that needed lubrication and joints that needed adjustment, but it was movement nonetheless. The Titan was alive. Outside, The watching orcs erupted into celebration. They bellowed their approval, fired weapons into the air, and engaged in impromptu brawls born of sheer excitement. Scarfang, seeing his investment paying off, declared that a great feast would be held to celebrate this achievement. But Grocker barely heard the celebrations. He was focused entirely on the Titan, on understanding what he had created and what it would take to make it fully operational. Over the following months, the work continued, but now it was refinement rather than restoration. The Titan was mobile, capable of standing and walking, though its gait was unsteady and prone to sudden stops when some system or another failed. Its weapons were installed but not yet calibrated, capable of firing but not necessarily at intended targets. Its armor was complete but untested in actual combat. There was still much to do. The weapons that the Orks mounted on the Titan were a hodgepodge of salvaged and jury-rigged armaments. On one arm, they mounted a massive cannon, a weapon so large it had originally been part of a starship's secondary battery. The recoil from firing such a weapon would have torn a normal vehicle apart, but the Titan's massive frame could absorb it. On the other arm, they installed a gigantic power claw, a close combat weapon scaled up to match the Titan's size. It was operated by massive hydraulic rams and could, in theory, tear through any armor. The Titan's back was festooned with additional weapons: rocket pods salvaged from destroyed aircraft, multiple autocannons for engaging lighter targets, and a massive flamer whose fuel tank was literally a converted tanker truck welded onto the Titan's spine. The weapon systems were controlled from multiple positions throughout the Titan, each station manned by an Ork responsible for his particular weapon. Coordination was achieved through shouting and the occasional use of violence to emphasize orders. The question of what to call this creation occupied Ork minds for some time. It was not, technically, a Titan anymore, not in the Imperial sense, but neither was it a Gargant, those massive war machines that Orks built from scratch. It was something in between, something unique. Eventually, the Orks settled on calling it a Stomper Titan, a name that acknowledged both its origins and its current nature. The first field test of the Stomper Titan was conducted against a target that Scarfang had selected specifically for the purpose: a heavily fortified Ork settlement that had refused to acknowledge his supremacy. The settlement's boss, an Ork named Grimtooth, had built his power on the strength of his fortifications, massive walls of scrap metal and concrete that had turned aside several assault attempts. Scarfang saw this as the perfect opportunity to demonstrate the power of his new weapon. The attack was launched at dawn, though in the perpetual haze of the Scrapyard, dawn was more of a concept than a visual reality. The Stomper Titan strode forward, its footsteps shaking the ground, each step leaving deep impressions in the compacted scrap beneath. Behind it came Scarfang's entire warband, hundreds of Orks in vehicles and on foot, all eager to witness the destruction that was about to unfold. Grimtooth's Orks, seeing the Stomper Titan approaching, initially tried to dismiss it as a bluff, some kind of crude facade designed to intimidate them. But as it drew closer, and they could see the massive weapons swinging to bear on their fortifications, panic began to set in. They opened fire with everything they had, bullets and shells sparking off the Stomper Titan's armor. But the Orks had layered so much additional plating onto the structure that most of the incoming fire simply glanced off or embedded itself in sacrificial outer layers. The Stomper Titan's response was devastating. The massive cannon on its arm fired, the recoil causing the entire machine to rock backwards slightly. The shell, a piece of ordnance large enough to require several Orks to load, struck Grimtooth's walls and detonated with apocalyptic force. A section of wall 50 meters wide simply ceased to exist, vaporized by the explosion or sent flying as shrapnel. The Orks manning that section of wall, if they survived the initial blast, were buried under tons of falling debris. Before the defenders could recover, the Stomper Titan fired again and again, each shot tearing new wounds in the fortifications. The rocket pods opened up, filling the air with contrails as dozens of missiles streaked toward the settlement. The autocannons added their own contribution, hosing down any Orks foolish enough to show themselves. And through it all, the Stomper Titan advanced, crushing obstacles beneath its feet, each step bringing it closer to the heart of Grimtooth's domain. When the settlement's gates finally came within reach, the Stomper Titan demonstrated the power of its close combat weapon. The massive power claw reached out, seized the gates, and tore them from their mountings as easily as an orc might tear the legs off a Gretchen. The gates, each weighing several tons, were hurled aside, clearing the path for the assault troops waiting behind the Stomper Titan. The battle, if it could be called that, was over within the hour. Grimtooth, seeing that resistance was futile, attempted to escape but was caught by Scarfang's orcs and dragged before the war boss. His settlement was claimed, his warriors absorbed into Scarfang's warband, and his possessions distributed as loot. And the Stomper Titan, having proved its worth in the most decisive manner possible, became the centerpiece of Scarfang's growing power. Word of the Stomper Titan spread quickly. Orcs from across the sector heard the tales and came to see for themselves. Some came to pledge their allegiance to Scarfang, hoping to share in the glory of serving alongside such a mighty weapon. Others came to challenge him, thinking that if they could defeat the Stomper Titan, they would inherit its power. All found that the tales, if anything, had understated the reality. For the Imperium, the existence of the Stomper Titan represented a significant threat. Intelligence reports filtering back from the sector spoke of a new class of Ork superweapon, something that combined the best features of both Imperial and Ork technology. Inquisitors began to investigate, trying to determine where the Orks had acquired a Titan and what could be done to destroy it before it became an even greater threat. The Adeptus Mechanicus, learning that one of their sacred Titans had been defiled by Xenos hands, declared a tech crusade. They dispatched a force of Skitarai warriors and tech priests to recover the Titan, or failing that, to destroy it utterly so that its machine spirit might find peace. This force would be supported by elements of the Astra Militarum and possibly even Space Marine forces, depending on availability and strategic priorities. But destroying the Stomper Titan would not be easy. The Orks had layered so much additional armor onto it that it was arguably better protected now than when it had been an Imperial Titan. Its weapons, while crude by Imperial standards, were undeniably effective, and perhaps most importantly, it was supported by a growing horde of Orks who saw it as a symbol of their race's ingenuity and power. The strategic implications of the Stomper Titan extended beyond the immediate sector. If other Ork warbands learned that it was possible to recover and repurpose Imperial Titans, they might begin actively searching for such machines. The galaxy was littered with the wreckage of countless battles, and not every destroyed Titan had been recovered by the Adeptus Mechanicus. The prospect of multiple Ork-controlled Titans was a nightmare scenario that kept strategic planners in the Imperial Command awake at night. There was also the question of what this said about the vulnerability of other Imperial war machines. If a Titan could be captured and converted, what about other irreplaceable assets? Super heavy tanks, starships, even Space Marine equipment might be at risk if the Orks became more sophisticated in their scavenging operations. The Imperium's strategy had always relied partly on the assumption that even if Orks captured advanced equipment, they would not be able to use it effectively. The Stomper Titan challenged that assumption. For the Orks themselves, the Stomper Titan represented a new pinnacle of achievement. Grokka became the most famous mech boy in the sector, his name spoken with reverence wherever Orks gathered. Other mech boys sought him out, eager to learn from his experience and perhaps recreate his success. This led to a proliferation of attempts to locate and recover other Imperial war machines, not all of which were successful, but all of which demonstrated the Orks' growing ambition. Scarfang, emboldened by his new weapon, began to expand his territory aggressively. Neighboring Ork factions were conquered or absorbed. Human settlements that had previously been considered too well defended to attack found themselves under assault by forces led by the Stomper Titan. The entire strategic balance of the sector began to shift, and Imperial commanders were forced to divert significant resources to contain the threat. The Stomper Titan itself continued to evolve. After each battle, Grokka and his team of mech boys would make modifications, replacing damaged components, adding new weapons, strengthening weak points that had been exposed in combat. The machine became a kind of living laboratory, a testbed for Ork innovation. Some modifications were inspired by captured Imperial technology, others were purely Orkish inventions, and still others seemed to defy any rational categorization. One particularly innovative addition was a force field generator, salvaged from a destroyed Ork gargant and adapted to the Stomper Titan's power systems. The field was nowhere near as sophisticated as the void shields that had once protected the Titan, but it provided a useful additional layer of defense against incoming fire. When active, the field caused incoming projectiles to deflect at random angles, with some shots missing entirely, while others were redirected back toward their source. Another modification was the addition of a transport capacity. Grokka had the interior of the Stomper Titan gutted and reconfigured to carry a mob of Ork warriors. These Orks could be deployed directly into combat from hatches in the Titan's legs, allowing Scarfang to use his ultimate weapon as both a destroyer and a delivery system for assault troops. The Orks who earned the right to ride inside the Stomper Titan were considered elite, and competition for these positions was fierce. As the months turned into years, the Stomper Titan became more than just a weapon. It became a symbol of Orkish achievement, proof that the Greenskins could take the best the Imperium had to offer and make it their own. Songs were sung about it in Ork settlements across multiple sectors. Young Orks dreamed of one day serving on its crew, or even building something similar. It had transcended its origins to become something mythic. But the story of the Stomper Titan also serves as a warning, particularly to the Imperium. It illustrates the danger of underestimating the Orks, of dismissing them as simple brutes incapable of sophisticated thought. The transformation of an Imperial Titan into an Ork war machine required not just brute force but also ingenuity, determination, and a kind of creative genius that exists nowhere else in the galaxy. The Orks may not build according to human understanding, may not follow the same rules or logic, but they build nonetheless, and what they build is often terrifyingly effective. For the Adeptus Mechanicus, the Stomper Titan represents both a tragedy and an abomination. One of their most sacred creations, a machine that had been consecrated to the service of the machine god, had been perverted into a weapon serving the enemies of mankind. The tech priests who learned of it mourned the loss of the Titan's purity and swore oaths of vengeance against those who had defiled it. Recovery operations were planned and executed, though whether these were successful is a matter of conflicting reports and classified information. The broader lesson, though, applies to anyone who might face Orks in battle. Never assume that anything is truly lost or destroyed beyond recovery when Orks are involved. They are scavengers and recyclers on a scale that beggars belief. A battlefield that has been thoroughly stripped by Imperial salvage teams might still yield treasures to Orkish eyes. A piece of equipment that humans would consider irreparably damaged might be the centerpiece of an Ork masterwork, and a weapon that was thought buried and forgotten might one day walk again, repainted in crude greenskin colors and serving purposes its creators never imagined. The specific fate of this particular Stomper Titan is uncertain, as is often the case with events in the grim darkness of the far future. Perhaps it was eventually destroyed by Imperial forces, its machine spirit finally granted the release of true death. Perhaps it still stalks battlefields somewhere in the galaxy, a walking terror that grows more powerful with each victory. Perhaps it fell to rivalries within the Ork factions, torn apart by those who sought to claim its components for their own use. Or perhaps it continues to serve, its legend growing with each passing year, a monument to Orkish ingenuity and a warning to those who would underestimate the Greenskins. What we can say with certainty is that the discovery of that sleeping Titan in the depths of the Scrapyard changed the course of events in that sector of space. It elevated Grokka from being just another mech boy to a figure of legend. It transformed Scarfang from a regional warlord into a power that threatened entire subsectors. And it demonstrated, yet again, that in the eternal struggle between the myriad factions of the galaxy, victory often goes not to the strongest or most sophisticated, but to those most willing to adapt, to improvise, and to turn the tools of their enemies against them. In many ways, the story encapsulates everything that makes Ork culture both fascinating and terrifying. Their complete lack of respect for the established order, their willingness to tear apart and rebuild anything they can get their hands on, their unshakable confidence that their way is the right way, all of these traits come together in the image of that repurposed titan. An orc looking at an imperial titan does not see a sacred relic or an irreplaceable masterpiece of engineering. He sees parts, potential, possibility. He sees not what it is, but what it could become if properly orcified. This mindset extends to every aspect of orc warfare and society. They do not respect your fortifications. They will tear them down and use the materials to build their own. They do not fear your weapons. They will take them from your cold, dead hands and turn them against your allies. They do not acknowledge the superiority of your technology. They will prove through practical demonstration that their crude approximations work just as well, if not better. And they will do all of this while laughing, fighting, and thoroughly enjoying themselves. Because to an orc, this is not just survival or conquest. It is the very essence of what life should be. The transformation of the Titan also speaks to the strange nature of orc technology and its relationship with reality itself. In the hands of humans, the Titan would have required an incredible infrastructure to maintain, tech priests to perform rituals, specialized parts manufactured to exacting tolerances, extensive training for the crew. The orcs bypassed all of this through the simple expedient of believing that their crude replacements would work. And because enough orcs believed, because their collective psychic field reinforced that belief, the crude replacements did work. This is simultaneously the most frustrating and most powerful aspect of orc technology. It should not function, but it does, and it does so in direct violation of the laws that govern everyone else's technology. If you have found this exploration of orc ingenuity and imperial tragedy engaging, please consider subscribing to the channel. We dive deep into the lore of Warhammer 40,000, exploring the stories, factions, and conflicts that make this universe so rich and compelling. Hit that like button if you enjoyed this particular tale, and let me know in the comments what other aspects of orc culture you would like to see explored. Until next time, remember, in the grim darkness of the far future, nothing is ever truly lost. It is simply waiting to be found and repurposed by those bold or mad enough to try.
I hope you guys enjoyed the story. Make sure to hit the subscribe, like, share button, whatever you want. Give me some feedback if there's any. And yeah, sleep well.